The Ontario government has just introduced its budget for the year, and it's the biggest spending plan in the province's history, with some consequences. What was expected to be a small surplus for the year ahead is now a $9.8 billion deficit. The budget was tabled as the Premier and Feds are at odds on two big-ticket issues, housing and the carbon tax. On the former, Ottawa is threatening to withhold more than $350 million from Queen's Park if the government there doesn't submit a revised plan to meet federal housing targets. And on the latter, Premier Ford is imploring the Prime Minister to stop the carbon tax increase set for April 1st, calling it, quote, cruel. Is the, some might say, unlikely bromance between the Premier and the Prime Minister coming to an end? And what does it say if it is? Let's bring in the front bench with me this evening. Former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant, he's now the CEO of Space Canada. Former Conservative Industry Minister James Moore is here. He's now a Senior Business Advisor with Dentons. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, as is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody. Great to see you. Rob, I'll start with you. You're in the thick of it there. Were you surprised at the scope and scale of the spending? And what do you make of the finance minister's message there that they can walk and chew gum at the same time?
Well, Vassy, at the risk of offending drunken sailors, I was surprised how large the deficit was. It is a $10 billion swing. Last year, this time last year, they projected a $200 million surplus, and they are off by $10 billion. This is a $9.8 billion deficit on, as you said, a record $214 billion spending plan. So they're spending a lot. It's actually unusual, too, Vassy. I cannot recall a Conservative government boasting, as the Treasurer did today, that they could have chosen to tighten their belts, but they're not going to do that. They're going to invest. So it's an interesting strategy. They basically want to be all things to all people. And Premier Doug Ford's Tories are still in first place in the polls. If an election were held here tomorrow, they would win another majority. So they clearly have gotten a formula that they can live with and that they think voters can live with. But this is a big spending plan, and it doesn't tackle some challenges on healthcare, housing. They're hoping to build 150,000 new homes every year to meet their targets. They're going to build 109,000 this year, but that includes long-term care beds, which are suddenly classified as homes in their stats.
What does it say, James, politically, that the Conservative government in Ontario felt that despite pressures on inflation, they still had to spend as much as they did?
Well, I also noticed in the budget that they have money for 4 new police search and rescue helicopters. They might need one of those search and rescue helicopters to find some fiscal conservatives out there who are increasingly nervous about increasing growing spending by the government. But look, on a spend of, I think it's $215 billion, a $9.8 billion increase, and they still arrive back to balance within, I think, 24, 36 months, is not a dramatic swing. And you look at some of the things that they're spending money on relative to what some of the demands were, it's pretty modest, right? New medical school at the university, at York University, I think is appropriate and needed given the increased demand for healthcare professionals in a growing province, and some of the money that they're putting forward on skilled training, some of the money for infrastructure as well, sports and recreation facilities with young and growing families. This stuff is eminently defensible. I think the macro fiscal framework is a cause for some concern, but I think overall, when you look at some of the expectations and demands for more spending, either partnered with Ottawa or from the opposition, I think it's pretty modest and pretty defensible from a Conservative perspective.
Does it also say, Brian, though, that, despite, the ability to, let's say, characterize it as modest, it's not exactly what you would think of as incredibly, fiscally conservative? Does that say something about what expectations are, or the political calculation around cost benefit of running a deficit and making the investments your constituents expect you to make versus not adding to inflation?
Yeah, well, a few things. So first off, when it comes to inflation and budgets, you also have to remember that delivering the same types of services is costing more, right? If inflation is impacting whatever it is you're investing in, whatever you're spending the money on, and in fact, there are some sectors that provincial governments would be responsible for, that the sort of inflation for that industry, for that sector, would actually be more than the average. So you also have to kind of think about that in the sense that even if you just stay at the same levels and sort of address the inflation of what you're investing in, you're going to have your budgets go up. Now, to the sort of politics of it, it certainly seems to me, I say this very humbly as we have some people on this panel that are in Ontario, but it certainly seems to me that over the years, Doug Ford has kind of gone closer and closer to the center. And as Rob pointed out, it seems to be working for him. It seems to be maybe that right lane for him, pun intended, where he's able to, sort of put some types of policies out there that would be seen as conservative, but not really sort of at the expense of saying progressive conservative. And I think when you look at the sort of plan to come to balance, that certainly would be a feather in the cap to go into the election and be able to say, look, we made all these investments. We were, not sure they're going to say it this way, but paraphrase, we were progressive conservatives, and yet we still balance the books. So if they're able to accomplish that from a political point of view, certainly would give them some momentum going into the campaign. And again, saying that from Shediac Bridge, New Brunswick, so I say it humbly.
Speaking of the politics of it, Tom, I mentioned in the introduction that there are a couple of instances in which, more than usual, the feds and the province and the premier and the prime minister are at odds. The carbon tax is one, but housing is shaping up. Rob's paper, first reported to be a big point of contention, with the feds now threatening to withhold the money, more than $350 million that was supposed to go to the province on that file. What do you think the political calculation is on either side of ending the bromance and moving on to a more antagonistic posture?
Well, I think that Ford's going to win this one, because at some point the federal government does overstep its bounds. It really is a provincial question, what and where you do in terms of housing. Doug Ford learned a very serious lesson in that last year, when all of a sudden he was going to take reserved lands that were supposed to be there for purposes of future generations and biodiversity and whatnot, took it out of the Greenbelt and said he was going to build everybody a house, and that didn't work. So now he's not going to be told by Ottawa what to do. And that's also a lesson, by the way, for Poilievre, who says he's going to just scare away all the gatekeepers, and he's going to be as interventionist as the federal government in telling provinces what to do. Ford is staking out some turf. Good for him for doing it first and foremost with Trudeau on this budget. I'd say that the deficit is of the order of magnitude of what we just saw in Quebec in terms of its increase. And in both cases, there's another subject that's worth mentioning, is that there are fairly large settlements with public service workers that had to be taken care of. Everybody kept things in abeyance largely during the pandemic, but there's been a price to pay, and there was a lot of money that had to be made available to settle all of those. I'll also say that when you look at the arguments back of the two key opposition parties, the official opposition NDP was using that old NDP chestnut that I might have seen once or twice myself before, which is, oh, this government is so out of touch. I mean, if that's your prime critique, then maybe Ford did pretty well with his budget. And with regard to Bonnie Crombie and her Liberals, of course, it was, this is not worth the paper it's printed on. And so going, okay, Ford is in pretty safe territory. I don't think he's about to be toppled by arguments like that. So overall, I think it's been a successful measure. He's showing he's willing to invest. He never spends. None of this is an expenditure. It's always an investment. He was very on message today, and Ford seemed very comfortable with the numbers he was putting forward, I believe with good reason.